Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Tonight we continue our conversation talking about legislative issues in the Rhode Island General Assembly, and I'm pleased that we have as our guest Representative Shelby Maldonado. Shelby, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, James, for having me.
So we're going to talk about your wage lien legislation in a few minutes, but with all of our guests, I like to get a little bit of background before we start about the substance of the matter. First of all, how'd you get involved in politics in the first place? You've been a rep since 2014.
Since 2014. So I actually was serving in Peace Corps for 2 years. And when I returned in 2013, my good friend James Dioso was mayor at the time. There was a city council seat at large opening, and he asked if I would run in that seat.
Is that where you're from?
I'm from
you were raised
Falls,
in Central Falls?
Yes, raised in Central Falls all my life, the youngest of 4 in my family. My mother is a single parent at the time and has been over the years. And so essentially, I can speak a little bit about going through the Central Falls school system, went through that, went to the University of Rhode Island where I received my bachelor's degree from URI in political science and communications. Went through the talent development system. Program, I should say, which was a great program and is still a great program for inner city students.
Yes, it is.
I then worked for the College Crusade of Rhode Island for about 2 years. Then I decided to join the U.S. Peace Corps, where I served 2 years in Zambia, serving as a health community outreach coordinator. When I returned, that's when I really got involved in politics.
Was it a quick turnaround from your return from Africa?
Yes. It was actually within weeks of being home that summer in 2013 that I was asked to run. And I was sort of taken back for a moment because I was still trying to get used to just electricity and running water.
Right.
At the time, I'd been living 2 years without running water, family, friends around, and my health wasn't too good at the time either. I had actually gone through two cases of malaria. So I was recovering from all of that. But once I was given the call, I took some time and then eventually just decided to run. Really, my city understood was recovering, but needed some more support and needed more of the people within the city to actually take on these responsibilities and be a part of the change that was happening.
This was after the bankruptcy proceedings had worked its way through the legal system,
Correct.
Right?
So at that time, we were going through the receivership process. Mayor James was really taking on the lead, hiring some great staff, along with getting the locals to run for office and sort of create this change by his side. So I decided to run in 2014. I was city councilwoman, unopposed at the time, so I was running, had no one up against. And so 2014, I was city councilwoman. But the unique part now is how I ended up at the General Assembly. At the time, I was working for Local 217 Unite here, along with Jenna Carlin. And we were organizing hotel workers in downtown Providence. And we were actually running a huge campaign for a $15 minimum wage for hotel workers specifically. It was about a year campaign. We had been working really, really hard to engage the community along with the City Council of Providence, council members there, along with the General Assembly. The fight led us to the General Assembly where we began to have to advocate in support of hotel workers earning a 15 minimum wage.
And this wasn't a minimum wage for everyone. It was
No.
just geared towards that one industry.
Just specifically that industry. And so essentially I ended up in the General Assembly, first time really inside the building itself and learning about how the system worked and who it was that I needed to speak with. And essentially I caught the eye of my great representative, Augustine Silva, who had been a rep for a number of years, and a great gentleman, a great asset to the city of Central Falls. And at that time, things unfolded. We had unfortunately lost that fight, but within about a few weeks after, He asked if I would run in his position.
He was deciding not to run again.
He was deciding. At that time, I think for a while, my understanding was he was looking to step down. He had been in politics for a number of years.
I remember him when he was on the board of trustees
Yes.
for the school system and active in the council as well.
Yes. He was really great. And when he asked me to run, once again, just being about several months into the city council seat, I was a little bit hesitant. But again, I figured, if we're going to make this transition happen, we need to continue with the momentum we have, bringing in young people into politics, and knew most importantly that my position would lead a future behind into becoming more involved in what we were doing. So I took up that chance, I took it up and ran against an independent, won about 83% of the votes in the city, where then I began to represent my city in the General Assembly in 2015, and now in my second term. It's been an incredible experience to just work aside with some of the great leaders in the General Assembly, both on the House and Senate. And one of the unique things is being able to deliver for my city at a different level. Now, my second term in, I've had the privilege to be co-chairing the Black and Latino Caucus along with Representative Carlos Tabone, and Vice Chair of Municipal Government along with Kathy Fogarty and Mia Ackerman.
And you're still involved in the labor movement.
I still am. I currently am employed and now have been about 2 years with UA Local 51, the plumbers and pipe fitters. They're doing a tremendous amount of work. Working with them has been a unique experience. They are truly the leading labor force just because the way they're approaching the idea that they need to diversify their trade. And by doing so, they are engaging in urban communities and organizations like Progreso Latino, Urban Ventures, and engaging them in conversations where they are requesting and understand the need to really bring in more women and minorities into the trades, because it overall benefits the labor movement along with just the state. And so it's been a very unique position to be there with them. The building trades are a great organization. So it's excitingly moving forward. I don't know where we're heading towards, but I'm sure it's going to be great.
You've got a lot of different irons in the fire, and you've got a lot of varied experiences for someone of your age. I've got to say that's remarkable.
No, it's definitely been great.
Yeah. So you represent a city of working people, and I know you've got an interest in a couple of different issues related to labor, but you've been working on wage lien legislation for a little while, and it's probably good to have a conversation with me, someone who doesn't know much about it, for our viewers' sake anyhow. Why don't you let us know what the legislation does and what problem you're trying to fix? Well,
this is my second term introducing this legislation called the Wage Lien. Essentially, in basic terms, it's allowing an employee to file a notice that they are going to put a lien on an employee's property. That notice would specify two things: the wages that are owed to them and what property they intend to put a lien on. Essentially, it's allowing whatever wage is owed that it be paid back. Currently, we do have a system in place, but there's no teeth to that legislation.
So when workers aren't paid what they're owed, this is a tool to allow the workers to get that money.
Exactly. And so there's a process in that. Essentially, all of the cases would go to the Superior Court. This has to be determined by the judge. The employee would have 90 days to respond to that notice of being that they would have a lien on their property. They have an opportunity to file a complaint against that lien. And essentially, the Superior Court judge will look at all evidence and within 30 days give a response back. Now, for example, let's say the employee were to file this complaint and the judge recognizes that the employee is just filing this to get back at their employer. There would be fees and court fees that would have to be owed back and paid by that employee. Similar to the other direction, if the employer is recognized that they're just filing this complaint and utilizing the system to benefit themselves, then they would as well have to pay the court fees owed and such. So both parties don't have an opportunity to abuse the system. Essentially, it creates a balance, and it ensures that people who are actually working out in the community are being paid what they are owed. It's not just creating job opportunities in the state, which is #1 priority for myself and for the state and the General Assembly, as we've emphasized, but ensuring that the jobs we do have in place, that employees are paid what they are owed, and essentially moving the economy forward and essentially the bill would allow that, protecting the workers' rights.
So what do workers have to do before they go to court to try and get a lien in place? Do they have to go to the Department of Labor first?
Yes. Essentially, they would go to DLT and they would file this notice, and it would be written by the Department labor and training. It isn't simply a note written to an employer that this is what's happening and that's it. DLT would file the claim, and let's just say the employee is unable to file that claim. DLT could file that claim on behalf of them. So it's creating a system where at no point would the employee have an opportunity to abuse the system in place. And overall, James, it's really ensuring that we don't allow people to be taken advantage of. And this is for someone of a business that takes advantage of wage theft. And that's not what we want to see in our state. So essentially, that is the overall aspect of the bill.
Yeah. So what types of industries are we talking about? In your experience working on this bill, let our viewers know, where the problems lie more often than not.
From what I'm gathering, it's really the low-paying jobs. It's really those that are working as dishwashers to bartenders, individuals who are fearful to actually give voice to these issues. And essentially, it's the everyday working-class families. It's protecting them, ensuring that they can provide for their families. These aren't individuals who look for issues, more they're just trying to make a living and continue to sustain their families, contribute to the economy. And that is where the protection of the bill allows for someone to move forward.
So these people, many of whom are most certainly working poor, wouldn't necessarily have to find money and shell money out for a lawyer in order to get this lien moving in the first place, would they?
No. They would be provided that service. Essentially, the employee, once they file that complaint, like I mentioned, the Superior Court judge would oversee the process. And we're talking not $30 complaints. We're talking about what I've gathered is like thousands of dollars. So someone who's going to file this complaint is essentially prepared to go through the process of going to the court proceedings and ensuring that no one on both sides wants to waste time. So that protection is set in place for both parties.
So what kind of advocates are working on this legislation, both for and against?
Fuerza Liberal is an organization behind that, Center of Justice. I work closely with John. Some of my local communities, my businesses in my city as well. My city of Central Falls as well. Some of the council members are supportive of this. Mm-hmm. Those that are in opposition, I would say, are more of these, I would say the larger organizations, maybe like Commerce, have come out in opposition to this, Northern Chambers. But I think what's unique about them is that they have been willing to sit down with me. There's been some language that we've adjusted on their behalf to strengthen the bill itself. So they've been very much positive in coming and sitting down and voicing their opinions. But overall, what I gather from them is that they essentially believe that this is to protect both parties, both the businesses, the economy, the people. So I'm hoping that along the lines in the coming weeks, we can come to an agreement and hopefully move forward.
It must be a challenge for business organizations to defend people who are taking money away from working people.
Oh, yes. It's very difficult. And I think that someone who comes from one of the poorest districts in the state understands that. All my brothers and sisters have worked low-paying jobs. I grew up watching my mother work 2 jobs, and the struggle that she had to go through when there were cases she had to come up to her boss about, speaking very little English. And these are the types of issues that are in actuality happening. And to say that it isn't is to say that it's not a reality, and that's quite silly of us if we were to say these things aren't taking place.
And this is also a situation where people miss a week's pay. These people might be losing their household, being able to feed their families.
That's right. That's right. And these are important issues we need to recognize that are essentially happening in our communities. And we have great businesses, and I can say for Central Falls, we have great businesses, local businesses that pay their employees correctly, that treat them correctly, that provide them with resources when needed. These are for individuals who are taking advantage of a system today and would otherwise not care less if the government of our state legislators weren't putting some power behind that and enabling the laws that we have today, but strengthening them as well. So in all, I hope that this year we see something come out and we can continue to fight and advocate for the working class families.
Sure. Are you working with a Senate sponsor as well?
Currently, we're in the process.
Okay.
We're in the process, yes. So we hope that actually the president last year, Dominic Ruggiero, was a sponsor of that bill. So we'll see this year how those conversations go moving forward as he's taking up his new role at the Senate side.
And you've already had a hearing on your bill in the
Correct.
House Labor Committee.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a great turnout. The community was very supportive. I have to give it to Fuerza Laboral, an organization that continues to mobilize our communities, bring people together. And it's been really positive. I think the committee itself on the House side asked some really good questions, but I think they feel that the sub-A that they've been able to look at hopefully will gain their attention and say, I think we can do something this year.
Representative Maldonado, thank you very much for coming into the studio.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
After World War II, the United States entered the Cold War era against the Soviet Union. Sparked in part by the Taft-Hartley Act's non-communist requirements, the CIO gave in to the media hysteria, and in 1949 and 1950 expelled a dozen unions identified as having leadership sympathetic to communism. These unions had almost 1 million members. For 20 years, the AFL and the CIO were bitter rivals, often attempting to steal each other's membership. Finally, in 1955, an agreement was reached to merge the two organizations into the AFL-CIO. This larger federation continued the relatively conservative and pragmatic approach practiced by previous labor leaders and gave outspoken support for the anti-communist and Cold War policies of the era. At the time of the merger, nearly 35% of the American workforce was organized, and in some ways this period marked the high point of union power in the United States. Several factors began to weigh against organized labor. The Taft-Hartley Act made it more difficult to organize, especially in the southern states with the so-called right-to-work laws. Among both national and local leaders, the labor movement lost much of the zeal of earlier years. Many unions and their members were content to protect their gains rather than push for the unionization of others, especially less skilled and low-wage workers in occupations dominated by women and minorities. The American workforce was gradually changing from predominantly industrial workers to people employed in offices, retail, and service industries, who often identified themselves more with management and who were not as likely to support unions. Also, organized labor at this time had a serious image problem. The AFL-CIO aggressively attacked the problems of corruption and racketeering inside the organization, and in 1957 expelled the Teamsters for failing to clean up their union. Another factor impacting unions was the increasing ability of companies to move manufacturing jobs to southern right-to-work states and eventually to countries with cheaper labor markets. Unions had never found an answer to this problem. The profitability of producing goods where labor costs are significantly cheaper inevitably drives companies to this practice. At first, industrial offshoring and the accompanying increase in imports was felt largely by the lighter industries, such as textile and clothing. But as other nations rebuilt from the devastation of World War II, more industries were impacted. Unions generally settled into a mature relationship with their employers, with the emphasis on contract improvements during this period of prosperity. These improvements, however, did not always come without struggle. In 1959, the steelworkers shut down nearly 90% of the country's steel production with a 116-day strike. After government intervention, a settlement was reached that included significant wage and benefit advances and a maintenance of the work rules which the companies were trying to erode. Beginning in 1954, the nation's longest strike, at the anti-union Kohler bathroom fixtures plant in Wisconsin, lasted for 6 years until the NLRB ruled against the company for its failure to bargain in good faith. And it was still 2 more years before a contract was finally secured. The 1960s and 70s were a time of social upheaval in the United States. Organized labor was not immune to the civil rights movement and the tensions of the Vietnam War. While some conservative AFL unions excluded African Americans even into the 1960s, the CIO had been quite progressive in the matter of race relations. To some extent, the merged organization inherited the CIO's pro-civil rights tradition, and after some hesitance, was a noted supporter of the landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Many more African Americans were joining the ranks of organized labor because of their significant numbers in the growing public sector unions. However, progress was slow. It took legal action by African Americans in the early 1970s to overturn a discriminatory seniority system in a Pittsburgh steel company, a system the union tacitly approved. To address labor's slow pace on these issues, the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists was formed in 1972. Latinos also made their first major impact with organized labor during the 1960s. Having toiled in the fields, Cesar Chavez knew the conditions agricultural workers faced. In the 1950s, he began a career as an organizer and later helped found the group which eventually became the United Farm Workers. In 1965, Chavez and the UFW joined striking grape pickers and organized a boycott of table grapes. The strike and the boycott drew national attention and widespread public support. While it was only partially successful, the union's persistence eventually led to the passage of the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act in 1975. This statute established the right of collective bargaining for agricultural workers in the state of California, a right that had been excluded from the National Labor Relations Act passed in 1935. Until his death in 1993, Chavez led strikes, boycotts, and protests to improve wages and conditions for farm workers. His leadership was recognized by papal and presidential awards. Parks, schools, and streets have been named after him in cities across the country. African Americans and women were joining the labor movement in large numbers via the growth of public sector unions, and by the late 1970s, women were making their way into jobs traditionally held by men. Women constituted 23% of union membership in 1973. By 1980, they had grown to 30% of union membership. In 1974, the Coalition of Labor Union Women was founded to highlight women's issues, to provide education and training, and to prepare women to take greater leadership roles in their unions. Public sector unions and strikes go back well into the 19th century, but both unions and strikes amongst public employees were almost always small, localized, and rarely successful. For example, in 1919, Boston police struck for higher pay and some influence with administration. Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge used National Guardsmen to crush the strike and fired the strikers. This loss chilled public sector unionism for the ensuing decade. In the 1920s, only about 7% of public employees belonged to unions, and virtually none had collective bargaining rights. After World War II, many teacher and public employee unions did strike for higher pay, but were met with repression by both management and legislatures. Strikes in the public sector were illegal, although scattered and mostly unsuccessful actions did occur when conditions became intolerable. All that was about to change. As part of the great social upheavals of the 1960s and 70s, public employee unionism mushroomed. About 10% of the public sector workforce was in a union in 1950. By the late 1970s, it was 40%. The growth resulted as younger, more militant workers wrested control from conservative leaders. Legislation certainly helped the upsurge. Wisconsin passed the first state law recognizing public sector unions in 1959. Many other states followed suit. President Kennedy issued an executive order allowing federal workers to organize for the first time, though without an ability to bargain for wages or to strike. As with the private sector in earlier decades, it often took job actions to win initial contracts and union recognition. In 1960, thousands of New York City teachers struck or called in sick for one day. Sensing a change in the political winds, the Board of Education ignored the state's repressive anti-labor law and agreed to hold a union election, which the striking union won overwhelmingly. This victory opened the floodgates. a wave of teacher strikes, slowdowns, and aggressive lobbying of school boards won pay increases and union contracts throughout the country. Once poorly paid and little respected, teaching became a true profession, with decent pay and improved classroom autonomy. In New York City, teachers' pay quadrupled. By the late 1970s, over 70% of the nation's public school teachers were represented by a union. Municipal and state workers followed suit. Strikes, sickouts, and various other job actions resulted in union recognition and first contracts. In 1958, there were 15 public sector strikes. In 1979, there were 593. Perhaps the best known of these confrontations took place in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968, where there occurred a confluence of the civil rights movement and the drive for public sector union recognition. Sanitation workers, largely African American, walked out, partly due to the death of 2 workers in an accident, but also to gain union recognition. The strike had strong racial dimensions, and the NAACP organized support. Martin Luther King Jr. was there backing the strike when he was assassinated. The eventual settlement won the workers higher wages and recognition of their union. The largest strike of public employees took place in 1970 when postal workers, some of whom were eligible for welfare, struck for better pay and a measure of control over working conditions. It began slowly with letter carriers in New York City, but quickly grew to 200,000 postal employees in 30 other cities. President Nixon used National Guardsmen to take over the Postal Service and ended the strike. While not a total success, the workers did gain a 14% pay increase, even though federal unions were not legally allowed to bargain over wages. The stronger unions that resulted changed post office employment into family-supporting jobs. The total number of union members in the United States reached over 20 million in 1975, the largest number ever, but this figure is deceptive. The addition of nearly 4 million organized public sector workers camouflaged labor's decline. Even with the public sector included, the percentage of the workforce in unions was down about 10 points from its peak 2 decades earlier. The J.P. Stevens Textile Company demonstrated how the legal delays allowed by labor law could be used to thwart unionization. An organizing drive launched at Stevens in 1963 took until 1974 for a successful union election, and then another 6 years in a national boycott before a contract was signed. Other companies followed this example to stall or defeat organizing efforts. The Business Roundtable, made up of a select group of CEOs from the nation's largest corporations, was formed in 1972 with an avowedly anti-union agenda. Later in the 70s, during the Carter administration, they were able to thwart labor's efforts to reform the Taft-Hartley Act and to increase the minimum wage. The biggest blow to labor was the bailout of the Chrysler Corporation in 1980. The bailout included wage concessions and the loss of 43,000 jobs. UAW leadership argued that the concessions were necessary to save the company, and that they were temporary. However, they were not a temporary aberration, but rather a trend that would define the coming decade.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.